Hi, everyone. This is Maya Nelly, and today we're going to dive into some topics from your Chapter 12 content on educational strategies, technology, and evaluation. Here are some of the learning objectives from this particular chapter. However, I'm only going to cover the first two. The first one, we're going to focus on describing key elements for delivering effective oral presentations. And then we'll dive into how to identify steps for planning a demonstration. I pulled this quote from your book right at the beginning from Benjamin Franklin, which says, "Tell me and I forget. Teach me and I remember. Involve me and I learn." I thought that this was a really helpful quote. And as we go through the discussion today, I want you to be thinking about what are some scenarios in which you've been in and learning scenarios, and what are some qualities in which that particular presenter or activity you engaged in that allowed you to engage in more learning, to retain more information. So before even thinking about providing a presentation, being able to give this, there's certain things that we really want to be thinking about before even the planning process. Some of those are going to include considering both educational and logistical factors. And it has to relate to your audience, right? Because this has to connect. I mean, we could have the best presentation in the world, have the coolest concept. However, if our audience doesn't, really care, maybe we're not reaching them, we're not going to be able to share this information with them in order for them to retain that information. Now, your previous chapters have talked about educational factors, some of which include nutrition education, maybe food literacy, or the resources they might have available. And then we're diving more into logistical factors here from your reading. So some things to consider is, what's the size of the group? If we're thinking about how to engage a certain part of your audience, how much engagement do you want? Are there platforms that you can include to include everyone, or maybe we're just including some folks? The number of meetings, how often are you going to see this group of people? Is it one time? How much information do you want to share based on this information? Whereas our class, we are meeting for one semester. We have modules that are presented to you. We're aware of this beforehand before we provide this content to you. And also the location. And I know that sounds kind of odd, right? But we want to think about, is this a face-to-face interaction? And also is this in a particular place where we have eye contact, body language that might be different? Or is it like us, where this is a virtual space? This is a pre-recorded recording, right? Where I don't get to have an interaction with you. However, you can pause, stop, rewind, forward the video as you wish. These are all factors that we need to be considering when we're creating content for different types of audiences. And that leads us into teaching techniques. Teaching techniques are going to be the objectives that you want your audience to achieve and to remember. So notice how I discussed this, learning objectives. You often find this in books that you're reading in school, right? Where it will begin to tell you, here are the learning objectives. This is what we want you to know. They give you the information, right? This is the top of the bun of our sandwich or hamburger, whatever you will. And then now we're getting into the filling, right? And then towards the end, we're going to finish that sandwich, right? Sandwich everything together of all of our meaningful learning experiences. Now, there's many ways that we can do this. So some other ways we want to consider, engaging our audience. We can create an environment that is conducive to hearing your messages, meaning maybe in our space where this is a pre-recorded lecture, right? We're creating an environment that has easy to hear lecture. You can see the slides on your own. Maybe you can fast forward or rewind the recording. That can be building an environment in order to be able to hear the message that I'm sharing with you. Also, creating active learning opportunities whenever you can. I mean, we can see words and do all the things, but we all learn differently. So having various ways for folks to engage with you is going to make the content more interesting and people be more curious about what you have to share. Next, we're going to dive into how do we create the planning process and incorporate these learning strategies. I pulled this figure from your book. If you're having a hard time taking a look at it here, depending on the device you're looking at, make sure to check it out in your book where you can zoom in and take a better view. But you can find this on page 290. And essentially what this figure is showing us is it's showing us the variety of different types of learning experiences. And there's some really great images in your book that show you how different people will learn throughout the process, whether it's a short or a long-term lecture. What type of engagement is there, right? So this can be a really great breakdown of like, how is this information going to be retained and how much of it? What do we hear? What do we see? How do we incorporate our senses into different types of experiences? And what is the overall end goal, right, that we want people to implement? So now let's take a view at some teaching techniques. Now I will say, these are just a few. There, of course, can be a few more. I highlighted the ones that are in your book. However, there could be far more. And things change, right? More types of different ways to learn change over time, as we've really seen with the pandemic, too. So we do want to consider presenting skills, right? Although you may not be able to see my face, I am using body language, presenting with confidence and animation, and that can come with practice, right? But before I even do all of that, before I even come in with confidence and animation, I have to have a background knowledge of this information. I also have to have some sort of development of the various techniques that I'm sharing with you. I also have to be excited about this content, right? Even if I may not necessarily be, which is not the case here, you want to be excited about it. That makes it easier to present information that is exciting. Now, one thing I did want to mention with this particular slide, I have a variety of photos of different folks on here. I want you to think about, is there a teacher or a presenter that really blew you away? What are some things that you noticed in their presentation skills? They were likely confident, they were likely enthusiastic, and super knowledgeable about the subject in which they were presenting. So as you are teaching others, this is something you also want to come off as well, being confident, but also being knowledgeable of everything that you are sharing. And that does come with practice and with preparation. Next up, we'll think about learning curves. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but whether you have a really long lecture or a really short presentation as this one, there is sort of this learning curve in which people sort of get really excited and then maybe some of the retention drops off. There's a really great image of this in your book if you wanted to get more of a visual aid in this particular type of example. But that's a normal part of the learning experience. So because we know that information, we want to think about maybe how can we incorporate more types of teaching techniques throughout a long or a short presentation to engage the audience. Some things you can do are to include an agenda in the beginning of this and a summary at the end. The agenda lets us know, what are we talking about today? And then the summary is a reminder of everything you've reviewed so far. And really just to check in if there has been any retention. And also provide engaging material. You want to be able to engage and ask inquisitive questions to get people thinking. Also want to be organized. I did allude to this earlier. We want to be organized even before we think about presenting with confidence and animation. Be aware of your audience. This may impact the types of ways you describe things. Maybe you have to think about certain word usage, certain types of knowledge base surrounding your audience. There's tons of things to consider with that. And even as the preparation point throughout your presentation, you may have the ability to see body language faces of how people are engaging or really engaging with your particular presentation. Does it look like they might be confused? Are they having a question? Do they look like they might and need a little bit more engagement? You can sort of tailor that throughout each presentation. And You can also tailor the presentation toward audience, and that's really what analyzing your audience is about. It can change. It's an ever-ending ebb and flow as you present, depending on the audience or population you're working with. Organization is huge, right? And as you present more, goes back to the practice, right? Maybe you presented this presentation, right? I could present this particular presentation over and over again, and I will be making changes throughout. So also making sure you have an attention-grabbing intro. That could be another tip. It's not always necessary, but could be exciting. Maybe you add it in the beginning or at the end. Adding sparkle throughout. I did like this wording from your reading because I really felt that that was a really great way to incorporate little tidbits of information, maybe a fun statistic, maybe an engaging activity or a fun question to engage your audience with. Having a memorable ending or a call to action, maybe, hey, this is your homework assignment, or this is what I want you to think about. What do you think about X, Y, Z? Making sure you're also thinking about body language if that is presented, talking about, speaking clearly, right? Oftentimes now with these recordings, we have a transcript for folks who want to have, closed caption like me. It's important to speak clearly so you are heard well. And also, changing the variety in which your vocal tone and your speaking. If I were to just speak monotone the entire time like this, do you notice any changes in how I'm engaging with you? Even though you can't see me, I'm able to change the tone in my voice to get a message across. And practice, that's going to be a big one, and also one in my personal experience. Here's a couple things that you can avoid to do as a presenter. And hey, we're only human. Sometimes it happens. Sloppy handouts, right? Anything that's last minute, people can really tell. Apologizing for things, even having an incomplete schedule, say for this class, if we didn't give a schedule to you at the beginning, hey, maybe we'd lose the rapport with our audience. It's also really important that at your presentation time, you're starting at the time in which the class begins, right? And I know that this can be tough sometimes when there's other things to consider. And also making sure you're staying within the time, right? People have an appreciation for you if you're staying within their time frame, right? And being respectful of the time that they are with you, thanking them for that. Try to avoid reading words verbatim. I understand that sometimes this is, what we want to do, what we can do, but for the entire presentation. Also, using incorrect names, it can be really awesome if you are engaging with an audience and you are aware of people's names and their preferred names and how they like to be addressed. Can you think of anything else? You may have seen those teachers I had you think about earlier. Even I know we kind of talked about, presenters that may have had some awesome qualities that had you learn, but maybe let's change it up. Are there any presenters or teachers, anyone that's engaging with you that you didn't really learn much and noticed, hey, these are things I probably wouldn't want to do? That's totally possible. So next, we're thinking about planning demonstrations. So in my experience, I'm a culinary instructor on top of going to school to become a dietitian, but I often do food demonstrations while also teaching various concepts. And this is why I added this image in here to help you all think of a real life example of how to apply this. And I teach in an online setting, so it is going to look a little bit different. So first we want to define the topic, and the ways that I do this is looking at the learning objectives. That learning objective really gives me insight into the outline that I'm going to work on in my presentation and demonstration. And then develop a sequential plan. What this can look like is, hey, I'm going to talk about this concept and that one in the outline, but then all of the things that I have in the outline have to make sense. One thing has to follow after another. It doesn't make sense for the last thing to be at the beginning. Part of pre-preparation activities, at least in culinary school, we talk about the term mise en place, which is French for saying everything in place. This is essentially what we're referring to, our mise, our organization. How are we preparing for the demonstration, right? If I'm doing a live demo with food or whatever it is, I have everything measured out and ready to go. I have my notes, I have my camera, laptop camera ready to go. I'm all prepared in my apron and chef coat and those sorts of things. Sometimes I even practice in my head a little bit beforehand. Also, I like to have a fun, attractive ending. Typically for food demos, this is more like a plated presentation of what I was creating that day. And although this is me thinking about a cooking demo, right, you can apply this to a variety of types of different demonstrations when we're talking about nutrition education. So some other teaching techniques we can think of specific to demonstrations doesn't have to be, like I mentioned, the live food demo. It can be a variety of different things. So the first category we have here are visual aids. I am a visual learner. I imagine that it is helpful for most of us to see this, so it's nice to have that because seeing is believing. We want to see things happen because it makes sense that way. So commonly in our experience, we've probably seen Blackboard or whiteboard, but right now what you're seeing is a presentation and a recording and something else called flip charts, right? There's multiple things here. Just like I mentioned before, this is not an exhaustive list. There could be a variety of visual aids in which you use in your demonstrations. Next up, we have action-oriented techniques. We want to get participation from people and interaction, because if we don't have that, what I've noticed in my experience, when there's a lack of participation and discussion in class, there tends to be people dozing off, camera off, that sort of thing. So something that I like to do is kind of like a reverse classroom setup where I ask engaging questions. Even though you're not with me right now, you may have noticed that I've asked you a few questions to think about, and that's on purpose. I want you to be thinking about certain things to help you learn these, different concepts so that you can apply this in real practice later. So some ways that you can do this are having a debate. This could be a discussion forum. This could be in real time. Role playing. What you'll be doing in this class is engaging in a counseling scenario. It's a perfect example of a role playing in which you could actually learn from and apply to a real life setting. Educational games. Some of these can include like Kahoot, if you've ever heard of that, online platform to answer games. Also polls here on Zoom potentially could be another way you utilize that. Simulations. I saw a lot of this in the pandemic when people couldn't really go to classrooms. I had to take my microbiology class in a simulated lab. And laboratories. This could be in person or simulated. And then finally, I think this is something that is ever changing, this technology-based technique. Fingertip knowledge, right? I really like that use of terms there in your book. There are so many different applications that you can apply to think about learning differently. So many resources, it's kind of overwhelming. So it is important to keep up with the trends. And also, I think a big one is knowing your audience. Does your audience have a smartphone to download this particular app? Do they prefer to text or call? Are they able to watch video clips? There's different apps you can use, and I even mentioned some before, like Kahoot, even like the polling here on Zoom, a variety of social networks. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Your book has more options here, and I bet you could even think of a few more. So in summary, what we talked about was a couple of objectives. The first one was we wanted to see the key elements in delivering an effective oral presentation. How are you going to provide instruction and incorporate learning strategies within this oral presentation? And what are some teaching techniques in which you can use to provide effective oral presentations? The next thing we discussed was how to identify steps for planning a demonstration within your presentation. What are some things to think about? Continuing our discussion of teaching techniques, we talked about some demonstration examples such as visual aids, action-oriented, what's the word here? Techniques, or technology-based techniques. And then finally, I'm going to leave you off with a fun nutrition joke. Why did the banana go to the hair salon? Feel free to pause or wait for the answer. Because of their split ends. I appreciate the time you took to watch this video all the way through. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. I'm happy to help.